Hi, this is Danae, and today's video is all about how to play and practice the chromatic scale. The chromatic scale is something that I include in my daily warm-up routine. I kind of just play through a chromatic scale every day with both hands and also in thirds. But of course, I also have some exercises that go more in depth and that I do when I have some problems with chromatic scales or when especially tricky or especially fast chromatic scales come up in certain studies or pieces that I play. So if you're interested in seeing how I practice the chromatic scale, then keep on watching. So first of all, I think it is important to talk about fingering. I have two fingerings that I use depending on what the situation is. The first one is what I would call the classic fingering for chromatic scale, and this is starting from a C, 1 3 1 3 1 2 3 1 3 1 3 1 2 3. So basically, whenever you have the two white keys without a black key in the middle, you play 1 2, and then the black key always has the third finger. I use this fingering in both hands, and this is what I would also suggest if you're only starting out practicing chromatic scales. This is the fingering I would suggest to start with. I started learning chromatic scales only with this fingering, and I didn't know about the second fingering that I'm going to tell you about for a pretty long time. So I only played this, and it works pretty well. It's quite reliable. You can play it very regularly, I would say. This is the way you can get the notes most even also, because it is the same fingering for every white black key combination. So this is the fingering I would suggest to start out with. Now, the second fingering is the Hanon fingering, and maybe you've already been practicing Hanon. Hanon has a great set of technical exercises for pianists, and of course, Hanon also covers the chromatic scale. And Hanon's fingering for the chromatic scale is a bit different. Whenever you have the three black keys, the last two combinations of white and black key are played with 1 2 3 4. So this means starting out from the C, you would play 1 3 1 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 1 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 4. So within one octave, you have the fourth finger just once and have the combination of 1 2 3 4 on the notes G, G sharp, A sharp, and then on the B you have the thumb again. Now this fingering I find useful in certain situations. First of all, when you have to play an especially fast chromatic scale, I would suggest using this fingering because, of course, the fact that you're playing 1 2 3 4 instead of 1 3 1 3 makes it easier to be fast because you just have to move the fingers no harder, let's say putting the thumb under other fingers, you just play it. So if you have an especially fast chromatic scale, I find that this one definitely helps. Also, if you have situations in pieces where, for example, the chromatic scale goes up and then back down at a certain point, I find that the fourth finger helps instead of going, for example, if you would have to return on the A sharp or B flat, depending on what key the piece is in. Of course, it would be much easier to just go 1 2 3 4 3 2 1 instead of going 1 3 1 3 1 3 1 3 back down. So this is something that I find helps in these situations. Also, this is not the Hanon fingering, but in the example that I mentioned before, when you have a chromatic scale that goes up and down in a piece and you have to end it on a certain note, I find that marking that note with a different finger helps. So for example, in Liszt's Rigoletto, there is this moment towards the end where you have a long chromatic scale that ends on an F and then it goes back down. It has to be pretty fast. The left hand is playing other stuff while the right hand is doing the chromatic scale. And I always play that specific point in that piece with the fourth finger on the F. So leading up to that highest note, I'm playing on the thumb on the D, D, and then 2, 3, 4, D sharp to E, 3, F, 4, because I find that instead of going 1, 3, 1, 2, and then back, somehow that doesn't feel so comfortable. I just do it with a fourth, go back down, and then go back to the classic fingering. So these are situations where I find that it helps to incorporate the fourth finger in the chromatic scale as well. But generally, I personally always kind of gravitate towards the classic fingering with 1, 3, 1, 3, 1, 3, even when the 3 black keys come. Then, of course, there is the famous Chopin study with the chromatic scale, Opus 10 number 2, where, of course, the fingering is completely different because you're actually training the weaker fingers, 3, 4, and 5. And the other 2 fingers are playing chords, while the upper 3 fingers are playing the chromatic scale. This, of course, is a special scenario, and usually this scenario would not come up in a piece. But if you want to train the weak fingers, I would definitely recommend practicing that study. It is, I find, really hard, but very, very rewarding, and it will really help your technique. I have a whole video that I made on how I practice Opus 10 number 2 by Chopin and what my exercises are. So if you want, I'm going to leave the link in the description box, and you can just check it out and see how I practice that study. As you probably know, I love talking about minimal movement while playing technically demanding passages. I'm a big supporter of not moving the muscles more than you need to, because it saves you time, because it prevents you from tensing up in places where you don't need to tense up. Whenever you have a fast scale or a jump or anything, I always say, remember to do minimal movement, because it's going to be more effective and just make things easier for you when you play. Now, when playing the chromatic scale, I find that minimal movement is incredibly important, probably the most important out of all the technical passages, because the chromatic scale is made up of so many little movements, because you're literally playing every single key next to each other as opposed to a scale or even an arpeggio. I think that minimal movement is so important. You have so many excess movements that you can do. For example, moving the wrist up and down for white and black keys. Definitely try to avoid that. Try to have a very even wrist and really have only the fingers doing the movement. Also, the fingers themselves don't need to go up like this. Try to really have them glued to the keys, stuck to the keys, because the chromatic scale is so fast, and usually the goal is to play it fast and as lightly as possible. So minimal movement really is key here in order to make that happen. Another thing that is connected to the whole doing as little movement as possible while playing the chromatic scale is where you place your fingers on the key. Many people I see, and also me when I started out playing, somehow naturally play the white keys a little below the black keys, because of course it's not very comfortable to be playing up there between the black keys. So you kind of place your finger on the white key on the lower third, I would say, of the key. And then when playing the black key, you're kind of not right at the tip, but maybe a little further inside. Now, when playing the chromatic scale, these positions on the key are not very helpful, because it would mean that your thumb is always kind of down here, and then you have to climb up to play the black key and then back down, and you're doing this kind of thing. And that movement, of course, is not helpful, and it's going to slow you down. It's going to make you have to move your wrist and hand and arm more. So ideally, you will play the chromatic scale in that line where the black key ends, and you would place the thumb on the white key just on that same level or just below where the black keys end. That way you kind of have one even line where you can play the chromatic scale. Of course, it's not supposed to be an exact line, that's obvious, and your hand is built in a way where the thumb is shorter. So of course it's going to be a little below, but just as a point of reference, I like to talk about the line between the white and black keys so that you also can ensure as little movement as possible. Generally, I would recommend to incorporate playing or practicing the chromatic scale on a pretty regular basis, because I find that this is one of these things that when you practice them daily and you kind of feel comfortable with it, when it comes up in a piece, because it's always the same, it's not in a different key, you don't have to adapt, it's not like it's something that you cannot practice daily, like you can't practice every scale in every key every day, but the chromatic scale is always the same. So when it does come up in a piece, it will kind of feel easy to you because your brain is immediately going to switch to, oh yeah, this is how I play the chromatic scale every day. It's just a chromatic scale and there you go, you're just playing it. So I feel that it is really helpful and rewarding when you practice this regularly, maybe even daily, because then you are really going to make your life easier when it comes up in a piece. I actually remember a conversation that I had with a very successful pianist once, and he told me that he actually feels that it's really difficult to play chromatic scales and that he never really practiced them in the warm-up routine. He always practiced scales and arpeggios and chords, but somehow his teacher never talked about the chromatic scale. And so whenever chromatic scales come up in a piece, he's always pretty nervous and has all these crazy fingerings that he does in order to make them work. And to me, I was just thinking to myself, wow, that's so lucky that I started practicing the chromatic scale so young, just daily, because when a chromatic scale comes up in a piece, I kind of feel safe in a way because I think, okay, it's just the warm-up thing that I do. I hope you understand what I'm trying to say, and I would definitely recommend practicing the chromatic scale on a regular basis. I hope that you enjoyed this video and that you found it helpful. Let me know if you have any other exercises or questions concerning the chromatic scale, and I hope to see you again in the next video. Bye!